On the day of, the Vunchen were supposed to challenge the humans. Most of the classes had to be delayed or out and out canceled. Reason being is there were so many eyes on the arena at this point that it was impossible for the Academy to actually continue with classes as no one wanted to show up. You can't exactly have school if less than 5% of your students and teachers actually show up, let alone show up on time. But they would simply sit there and watch to see what the humans might do. The Vunchen, though insectoid and reptilian, kind of a mix between the two, were more apt to be in mountainous terrain. They opted to be in more of the urban terrain, and this confused everyone, at least for a while. Then they realized that the reptilian portion of the Vunchen could easily scale walls, and the fact that the Vunchen can fly with their two sets of wings, as in two sets of four wings apiece, they simply would be able to hover around and get a good look at the battlefield. They'd be able to see the humans coming. Along with that, they had the ability to sense heat. This gave them an incredible advantage, mainly due to a simple fact. There was no time off. Normally, these games would stop when the sun went down, as it was dangerous for everyone to move around at that time. Seeing as there was no sorts of electronics where they'd be able to scope out the area, those that couldn't see in the dark very well would simply be at an extreme disadvantage. And yet, the Vunchen insisted that they have all the time, all 7 of their planetary rotations, every single one of their days, which was just about 30 hours human time on each day. This would come out to a lot of hours that they would have to watch out, and they realized that the humans, being very, very sneaky, they would have to watch out for any possibilities. But they insisted that the ordnance be limited, extremely limited. They would be able to have their small sidearms and, of course, their long rifles. At least that's what the humans call them. They weren't exactly rifles, but that's neither here nor there. Along with that, they would be allowed whatever sort of covering they wanted to bring with them. No electronics of any type, to include communications equipment, with the one exception of the emergency retrieval beacon that everyone was required to wear. If you got injured and you were out of the game, you simply pulled the pin, and the emergency beacon would call for a drone to come and get you. At that point, no one was to fire on you, and if they did, then they would be out of the game instantly, and their team might lose completely, considering how dangerous it was for some creatures to simply just lay there and bleed. Most of them didn't actually patch their bones up, or their skeletal system, or their tendons, or their musculature, or their facial system at all very well. If they started to bleed, it risked their own life. So it was important that this not be in any way, shape, or form confused. But this also allowed each of the species to show what their species can do when limited on what they have. The humans insisted on having these strange paint knives, as they called them, anything they could use to simulate a blade. The Vunchen laughed at this, believed that the humans couldn't even get anywhere near close enough to use it. But then again, they thought about what happened to the Zeknekel last time, and then relented, as they didn't want to seem at all cocky. They saw several different species, all of which were above in the rankings to the Vunchen, to get taken down by the humans, but the Vunchen had been planning this for a long time. As they began to get ready and set up, they realized that they had to start as one big group. They couldn't set up any traps as though they wanted to, which was normal. What they would do is set up a bunch of deadfalls and things of that nature, so that other species would simply have to go in and either treat the wounded, or they would simply leave someone to die. This would allow them to go in with ease and take out several of the opponents, but with the inability to do this, well, they would have to rely on everything else they had. The humans, for everything they had, showed up with not 8 this time, but 9. They had an extra. This extra had her ears poking straight up in the air, and simply looked over and kept her eye protection on, and started complaining how it didn't fit right. She had to keep it on, at least for a while. If they wanted to take it off after the buzzer went off, then they could. which most humans didn't actually. Many of them actually kept on a very dark lens, which was very creepy for most because now you couldn't see their eyes. They were seemingly not human at this point. And with that, they all prepared. They gave the signal that they were ready to go, and as soon as the buzzer sounded and the flares went up, everyone went to their positions. The humans split into two smaller groups, one with 4, one with 5. With that, Larry, Vince, Jenny, and Gregnar all took off in one direction. The other 5 took off running, and they would not be seen. This was surprising. Even the drones that were there to try and find them, to keep up, couldn't keep up with them. The drones were obviously hidden by all optics. You couldn't see them, you couldn't sense them, and they were almost completely silent. Not unless you were right next to one could you tell it was there, which was how everybody was able to keep pace with all the humans and the Vunshin as they moved about. The Vunshin simply moved out in a strange way. They didn't seem aggressive at all, but instead they moved out slow and methodical. Looking at an overlay, you could see that they were simply, like an energy shield, building out further and further and further, making a bubble around their starting point. They knew that if the starting point was taken, even if they were able to take out the humans, they still officially lost. Even though the game wouldn't end if your home base was taken, it didn't matter. The Vunshin were very methodical now. As much as they were as being assholes, they were even better when it came to traps. And they wanted to use the urbanized areas as best they could. The only issue is that their area, the one that is most likely their home, didn't stretch all the way out. It was barely a half a kilometer before it changed into another species style, and that is the way the whole urban area went. In some areas, it was like the Zeknekel, others the Nashini, others like the Ko. Even the humans had a small area for themselves, which is actually where they started out at. Everyone simply assumed that this was to give themselves home field advantage, yet they all watched as the human vacated this area. They watched Larry, Vince, and the rest of their group move over, but the camera still couldn't find the second group. They had simply disappeared off the map. They tried to use heat sensors, but nothing worked. How were the humans doing this? Then they tried to use heat sensors across Vince as he ran across right in front of a camera, so close that the air of him running by was enough to move the camera slightly. They couldn't sense him with the heat, not except when he was right next to it. Everyone watching laughed at this as they realized that the Vunshin were going to use heat to try and figure out where the humans were. The humans, led by Larry, ended up on top of a large mound, which was very similar to a Zeknekel type of skyscraper, at least their version of it. It only had about a 500-foot vertical, but that was enough. They went and they started to stick their weapons outside of the holes themselves, just looking and scanning, looking around, trying to see where the Vunshin had set up. The Vunshin, for their credit, were not stupid. They went and they pulled out their optics that they could. You're not allowed any type of craziness on your weapon, but you can have anything similar to binoculars. The only problem is you're only allowed one of them. The humans didn't carry any, which was surprising. Yet, they still sat and watched. And they waited. Eventually, they could see the way the Vunshin were, and anyone watching on the screen could see that they were taking notes inside little bitty pieces of paper. And after the entire day, nothing had happened. Everyone watching was a little confused at this, as the Vunshin had taken much more territory, as there was almost 300 of them on that entire area as they slowly moved out. Some of them being on top, overwatching, as others moved through the buildings, clearing them. But the humans waited. They waited for a long time. Eventually, at night, the humans began to move again. This time they all pulled back, and they moved themselves around a certain area. A small light could be seen, but for only a moment. As the camera moved over, they could see that there was just the slightest bit of light coming from underneath what looked like some sort of piece of cloth that was draped over them. They all seemed to be chatting a little bit, but it was difficult to hear anything. Eventually, the light turns off. The cloak or tarp or whatever you might call it decided to pull its way off and immediately was draped across Vince's back. Jenny simply stood up and said, "Okay, let's do this." And then they began to move. It was at night. Humans can't see at night. People would look and they could see that the humans had swapped out their eye protection, which was dark, for now something that was clear. Oh, so maybe they can see. With the fact that there were multiple moons on this planet, it gave a lot of light down. Not enough for most species to see very well, but the humans seemed to be able to use this very well to their advantage. But it wasn't the humans that led the way. Everyone was totally shocked at what they saw, as every time a camera saw the humans coming, they saw the very slightest glint of green. 2 glints of green, that is. As right in front, Greknar led the way. Her eyes had somehow been able to retain their ability as they could back when she was a Forced, a full-blood Forced that was. And now she could see in the dark exceptionally well. She led the other 4, weaving in and out of buildings, actually getting very, very close to the Vunshan lines. So close, in fact, that everybody thought that the shooting would begin to start. They figured the Vunshan would figure out what was going on. They watched the cameras, but the Vunshan seemed oblivious. Many of them fell asleep. Others were simply on guard, flicking their tongues in the air and waving their antennae, trying to figure out if the humans were on the move or if they were even close. On a few occasions, a Vunshan would perk up, and within moments, all the humans simply froze in place, not moving even a single muscle. If anyone would look over in that area, they wouldn't see anything unless they could see in the dark. The Vunshan, for everything, had terrible night vision, but they could sense the heat. They could tell movement. They just can't see in the dark, which you would think would be something detrimental, but the fact that the heat allowed them to travel at night and allowed them to hunt at night, as that is the way their species was, this was going to be dangerous for the humans. Very, very dangerous. They eventually got close, and many people realized that the humans had put their long weapons across their back as they moved, and simply drew their small sidearms and were continuing to move down, keeping their weapons up and clearing every single corner as they went by. Slow and methodical movements. But the scariest things of all, even as the microphones were cranked up as high as they could go, you could barely hear a thing. The humans didn't speak at all. They simply waved their hands, gave different gestures with the fingers as they looked at each other. The most you would hear is them snapping their fingers, a gesture that most species didn't even know was possible, as they don't have fingers to snap. They continued to watch as the humans would only use this to get someone else's attention. But a simple is a sound you hear all the time. It's simple debris falling, maybe a twig broke, maybe there's a critter moving around somewhere. So whenever a Vunshan heard this, it was looked at, examined, and immediately dismissed. The humans were getting very, very close. Eventually, dawn began to show up, and the humans were perfectly still in a small little cubby. Just this tiny little area, so small that most of them barely fit in. But they were seemingly in perfect position. The Vunshan, as light began to show, began to move out ever so slightly. And as they got close, the humans began to stir. They began to move their bodies just slightly from one side to another, twisting themselves towards the openings. And they waited. The Vunshan continued to push out, One or two were looking at a door, and at this point, they were a little upset that the humans had not come in. They were all actually talking, all sorts of crazy talk about how the humans must have run away. Maybe their reproductive organs fell off. Maybe they had lost their courage that way. Many, many insults. This wouldn't take long. As they finally got close to the door, everyone watched as Larry simply had his pistol in one hand, reached down and pulled that knife that would spray out a certain orange, a blaze orange they called it. This would be how they signified that one was down. And if anybody who was down and knew it used their weapons or even fought back or even said anything except to call for help, their entire team loses. So no one was going to risk that. This was a pride thing. This was an honor thing. This was a I need to show that my species is a badass thing. And as they finally reached the doorway, they seemed to bypass the door Larry was at. And he was perfectly still. His head was turned as his back was towards the wall, as he watched as the shadows pushed back one right after the other. And just as the last one passed by, you could see his head look down, and he slowly turned outside the doorway. Silently, he turned around, button-hooking the door, raising that pistol, noticing there was no one behind, but now he's stationed right behind the whole group of Vanche that are walking down this hallway, or what can be considered a hallway. He silently crept up, putting his pistol back in the holster, reaching up, grabbing one across the maw and putting the knife against his neck. Inside, the internal earphone went off with a slight which signaled that they were done. It couldn't scream as Larry was holding its mouth. It simply stopped, and Larry let go. The other Vunchin didn't even know this has happened, and Larry went up. A second one. A third one. A fourth one. The final one was sitting there, trying to joke with those that was behind it as it swung its weapon sideways, trying to maneuver this very large paint weapon around this very tight hallway. Larry decided something strange. Nobody saw this one coming. He walked up behind, tapped it on one of its shoulders, and as the Vunchin turned around, it simply grabbed the weapon and then shoved the knife into its neck. Now, of course, this is not going to hurt. It doesn't hurt at all, except for the actual impact of the fist against the neck. But the Vunchin was all of a sudden confused. What the frack? It turned around and saw that its entire patrol was gone. This similar scenario played out at least a dozen times per human, or humanoid in one case. However, Greknar was not as decently well trained as the other ones, and she ended up having to draw her pistol once or twice to actually take out a few more, the last two or three, but she was still able to silently take them out. By the end of that day, the Vunchin had realized that many of their patrols had gone missing as they had not checked in. They sent several others over there to see what was going on, and all they found was the small piece of paint splatter that was left on the ground as to signal that's where a body was. They had noticed drones coming in, but they didn't realize that their own people had to leave. This was confusing to them. How could they lose so many? There must have been 70 or 80 of them gone. How could they do this? How could they possibly do this? And with that, the Vunchin realized that they might have bitten off a little bit more than they could chew. But all they ended up doing was tightening their lines, making larger patrols as they got ready to push out even more to hunt down the humans, not realizing even where the humans were. They began to scan even more, keeping everybody awake, even though they insisted that they needed some sleep. The humans didn't sleep that night. The most they did was to stop and change something they call socks, and then to get a little bit of food and water in them, and then continued. Everyone watched with complete horror as the nighttime came in, and not only Greknar, but Jenny began to move in the darkness as though it wasn't an issue. They couldn't figure out what was going on, and when the camera turned, when Jenny passed by, there wasn't green, but 2 light blue flashes every single time that they came into the first view of the camera. The cameras themselves kept having to adjust for the low light, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Maybe that's just something of the humans. They couldn't really tell because Vince and Larry both still had their eye protection on. But was this a common thing? They would look closer, and through the night vision they could see that the eyes were much stranger looking, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. As they continued through the darkness, Jenny and Gretnar found another patrol, a patrol that had stopped for the night. They were sitting there trying to cook their food, and they waited. They waited till they both got in a position. Both of them were slightly blinded by the small fire that was there to keep them warm from the night. Being part lizard, they are in fact cold-blooded, and they need some sort of external heat source. With that, both of them seemed to give each other strange signals with their hands, and then they lined up. Everyone was in extreme anticipation watching the video as Jen held out her hand to the side, just low enough that the Vunshin couldn't see, but Gretnar could. She held up 3 digits, then 2 digits, then 1 digit, and then she brought that hand up, and simultaneously her and Gretnar began firing into the group of Vunshin. They were all hit before they were able to even reach their paint rifles, all screaming, "What's going on? What's going on?" But it was over in moments. And with that, Gretnar and Jen disappeared into the night again. In another area, Larry simply walked up, found one of the Vunshin relieving themselves, and seemed to wait, and tried not to laugh as he held his hand over his face. He could almost tell that there was a camera because he spoke silently. Maybe this'll scare the shit out of him. He seemed to look left and right as though he didn't actually know where the camera was, but he could tell it was close. He then ran up to the one that was relieving himself and in a flash ran by, shoving the paint into the thing's chest. And the Vunshin, confused at what happened, could hear the in his ear again. How am I done? It would reach up towards its chest, right where one of its 3 hearts is, and realize that it was coated in blaze orange paint. And of course, inside its earpiece, he would hear again, as a signal to shut the hell up. With that, all he could do was start walking away, silently walking into the night towards the recovery area and hoping that a drone would come and pick him up as he was very tired. As he was walking, he would hear others walking. He turned and looked, realizing he was out. It wouldn't matter if they shot him. If one of the humans shot him, they would lose immediately. So he wasn't concerned about that. But as he walked, he looked over, and there was another, and another, and another from his group. How the hell did that happen? Some of them had blotches, as though some sort of thing had stabbed them. Another one had a slash mark across its neck. Another one right across its face. One of them looked clean until it turned around. And there was a slash mark that went from the back of its neck, down its carapace, all the way to the base of its tail. They knew that had this been an actual blade, it would have been lethal within moments. They all were confused, but they knew better than to talk. They simply lowered their heads a little bit and continued to walk towards the rallying point. Vince did something similar, but in many cases, he liked to get a little more loud. He would line things up, and many times he would shoot 1 or 2, make them begin to freak out where it was, reposition themselves, fire again 1 or 2. As they called for help, he would disappear into the night and wait. And as those that had been taken out left, others showed up to reinforce the lines. The ones that were still alive were now reinforced with 2 or 3 times as many Vunshin as before, and putting things on such a fast-paced shot one would be mistaken to think that it was a full automatic, as would be fired off into the night, and more Vunchen would just fall prey to the shots. This would happen 2 or 3 times until the Vunchen got wise and simply abandoned their post and ran back to the main group. Many of them began to scream into the night that they were being assaulted and they needed to go back towards the rallying point, and the lines began to retract more and more and more. Throughout the night, the humans never seemed to stop. They were always on the Vunchen's tail, literally in one case, as one of them was simply trying to catch up to its brethren as it decided to finish off its food before walking, and immediately got tagged right in the base of the tail. Screeching as it went down, it realized that if it said too much and did not count it as a kill, it was getting its shot again, and simply raised its hands, signifying it was done. And then, of course, the wave it had to do next to the microphone in its ear, until he started hearing the Normally in the games, if you're only hit once, it didn't have to be lethal, but in this case, they wanted to make sure. That was in the rules, and the humans knew it. The next morning, the Vunchen were back to their first few hours of lines, as their numbers were less than half. Many of them still trying to figure out how the humans were able to move around at night without any type of electronic devices, no extra optics or anything like that. They knew the humans weren't too fond of having any type of scope, any type of binoculars. As they said, it's too heavy, it'll slow them down. Yet, here they were, 2 nights in a row, and they couldn't sleep. 2 days, and they couldn't sleep. Now what was next? What could possibly happen? They tightened their lines so much they realized there was no way a human could get through, not without signaling something. They would all hear something. They would see something. They even had their own hovering above the skies. They made sure there were certain roads that were wide open. The humans couldn't possibly pass by without being noticed. As sneaky as the humans were, there's always limits. And they waited all day. It was the middle of the afternoon, and they were finally trying to get ready for their meal of the day. And then suddenly they could hear screaming from their starting point. They had left the group there. Their highest ranking ones had been sitting there trying to coordinate everything through messengers and things of that nature. But now they were screaming what was going on, and all you hear is what the heck was going on? They all pulled back towards the starting point, but none of them could get close. The Vunchen were completely amazed at this. The humans that had disappeared had reappeared, all of them covered in all sorts of manner of filth. They had come through the sewer system of all different species. They had waded through 2 days of shit just to get in position, and now they had simply ambushed the command and control. And now everything was total chaos. As the Vunchen tried to get in, they began firing towards the inside of their starting area, hitting nothing but their own people as they tried desperately to get away. The insectoid part of them tried to take flight as best they could, but they either got solid blaze orange on their back or solid pink orange on their front. It didn't matter what they did. None of the command group made it out. And with that, the humans set up their own defense line, moving all sorts of bunkers and debris in the way, making sure it was impossible for the Vunchen to get anywhere close without being exactly where they needed to be to get shot. Using long hallways and T-intersections, any type of linear danger area was used to stop them, and it was of great effect. There were several assaults trying to take back their command and control area. They knew if they didn't take it back, they would be completely lost. They would lose the game if they didn't take that back. Even if they were able to take out the humans, losing this was enough that officially they won, but in truth they would lose. So they were trying to make a plan to get ready. More and more of them had been taken down. Now barely 15% of their starting group. They wanted to figure out if there was a way to simply run in. They knew that if they had remembered to have what the humans call a grenade, they would have been able to clear out the area. Then again, through their research, they realized how efficient humans are with this device, as it is their device. And they wouldn't even have stood a single chance if that was the case. So they tried to figure out what to do. As they did, and having their command and control gone, many of them were getting frustrated, incredibly frustrated, as they were not able to take down a single human as of yet. They couldn't even see them before the humans simply showed up out of nowhere, and now, lacking sleep, lacking food, trying to figure out what in the hell was going on, they were getting beyond frustrated. And with this, they thought they saw one. A yell came out, "There's one! There's one! There's one!" Shots went out as they began to chase the humanoid figure as it ran through the streets. It was dodging, ducking, and running, ran into a building as shots were landing next to it. It seemed to be a master of parkour as it was flipping around in different ways, diving through windows and doorways. They were having trouble keeping up with it. The Zunchen even used their wings to try and get more speed as they slanted their bodies and ran into the area. All of them charging towards this one creature. They wanted a piece of the humans. Even if it was a small piece, they wanted a piece. And they chased it like crazy. But damn, this thing was fast. Seemingly jumping on all fours sometimes, leaping up in the air into the second floor, going again through more windows, weaving in and out of alleys. The ones that were in the air were trying to get a shot, but every time they tried to and line it up, suddenly the human would turn and duck a different way, and they had to get even closer. And just as they realized it's going towards an open area, they screamed to their brethren, "It's going to be in the open! It's going to be in the open! Keep pushing it! Keep pushing it!" And they realized they would be able to catch this human in the open, and there would be no place to hide anymore. They bolted towards that area. Those that were flying tried to get ahead of it. They saw that it was heading straight towards the opening, and as the human seemed to be right there, it ducked into another building and then ran towards the doorway and came out a totally different area, bobbing and weaving as it went, shots landing where it used to be. How is this thing so quick? How can it turn so fast on two legs? What the shit? And that is when the main group came out. They were told by their last commander to line up as fast as they could, get ready to fire, and they all tried to line up their shots as those in the air were getting ready to get their shots in, trying to corral the human back towards their own lines. And that is when everything went to shit, as suddenly from the opposite side, they realized that they had been flanked. They had been baited into an ambush. They had all chased this human that turned out to not fully be human. No wonder she was so fast. And the humans, with unbelievable accuracy, began to fire down. Those that had taken the command and control area had followed the group, taking out those that had fallen behind. The stragglers were now on their way to the rallying area, and here they were, the final group, out in the open, fully exposed, being fired at from all sides with unbelievable precision fire. As they moved their weapons left and right, they began to fire all the way around. Those that were in the air tried desperately to get up high and still caught more rounds between the wings. This would make most of them lose their ability to fly for several seconds as they began to plummet towards the ground, and a few of them crashed pretty hard. Thankfully for them, they didn't have far to fall, as there was either foliage or buildings for them to land on, though it was a very satisfying thump to those that didn't like the Vansha. They really did not like them. They seemed to be those that were going to bully other races, especially those that were smaller than them or weaker. Didn't matter. But there was cheers that were heard all over the planet as they watched as the Vanshan were simply blasted apart. A few of them tried desperately, trying anything to find any sort of cover or concealment, to the point where one of them actually tried to pick up one of their own that was already signaled that he was dead and used it as a shield as it ran for any sort of cover it could find. But as it turned the corner, right in the mouth, it got hit with one of the paint pellets. This was enough to make it choke and vomit all over the ground. This was almost as bad as another one that jumped up, trying desperately to run at one of the human positions he could see where it was. He ran towards it, but as he raised himself up, it got shot right in the genitals, and down the male went with a serious thud, screeching in pain. The female that actually came out all of a sudden, screaming about how her mate was going up, but was not fired at as she went to see if the male was okay. With that, the battle was almost completely over, and there was only a few Vunchin left. They were still chasing Greknar as she was beginning to run out of her own air. She knew that being human, she could run for a long time, but she couldn't keep up the maximum speed for too long. And the Vunchin could simply use their wings to keep pushing. Those that didn't care that their brethren had been shot to shit were still chasing her. Down to only 2. Greknar realized that she had turned into a cul-de-sac and there was no way out. She turned and faced them, and the Vunchin simply turned, raised their weapons, and then one of them raised that strange mandible claw that he had and put it on the weapon, signaling to stop. Greknar was confused, trying desperately to catch her breath. She then looked over as they both dropped their weapons and began to get in a fighting stance. Oh shit, she thought, as the Vunchin males that were facing her were much, much larger than a female, and far more dangerous. They reared up and charged her, and immediately they went after her. One of them simply stood back after taking a few steps forward, figuring this was going to be personal. The male reached up, picked her up, and smacked her across the face as hard as he could, and then began to grab her by the shoulders and whip her around, smashing her into the side of the buildings. They knew this was disqualify them, but they didn't care anymore. They knew the battle was over. Not only that, then they grabbed her by one arm and one leg and actually threw her around like a goddamn rag doll. As they watched, they suddenly heard and the one that had just been watching had took her round to the back of the head. They looked over, and that male suddenly realized he might have just fucked up. As he dropped Greknar, she was on the ground groaning in pain, and the look of the humans was unmistakable, that of unmitigated rage. They all seemed to slowly circle around this male, and everybody watching was on bated breath, wanting to know exactly what the humans were going to do. Suddenly, Jenny burst out and ran over to Greknar to see if she was okay. And then Larry showed up. He saw what was going on, dropped his weapon, immediately pulled off his ghillie suit. Others helped him to take it off, as it seemed to be almost stitched to his skin. It was so well put on. This urban ghillie suit might have been a lot lighter than the ones they needed in the woods, but it was still enough that it took some time. The male Vunchin looked at him and seemed to be enjoying this as he was still desperately trying to gain his air back. They're great ambush and sprint predators, but after running so much, he was simply out of breath, and he needed some time. Larry got out of his stuff and was immediately handed a knife. He looked over at Vince, who was holding it hilt towards Larry, and Larry simply turned and shook his head. With that, Vince just nodded and put the knife back in its sheath. Larry walked up slowly, looking at the Vunchin that towered over him. The Vunchin seemed to grin, knowing that this was going to be a one-on-one fight. "So what are you going to do, little man? You stinking, evil, hairless monkey. You don't have what it takes to..." And with that, Larry drove his fist as hard as he could right into the Vunchin's torso, right below his third heart. He knew this was where it hurt the most, outside of hitting him right in the genital region, which at the point was not accessible. Immediately, the Vunchin staggered back and then fell over, desperately trying to catch his breath. It was in excruciating pain. Larry stood up and said, "Well, since I can't treat you with gunpowder and lead, this'll have to do." The Vunchin looked over, and Larry backed a giant foot up and kicked him right in the head. The Vunchin couldn't figure out why it hurt so much and would find out later that steel-toed boots really, really hurt. With that, Immediately, they could hear the speakers going off, screaming about disqualification and so much, but this was a personal matter. With that, security personnel showed up and told Larry to calm down. The Vunshin himself was in the wrong and would be disciplined if they found out he was going to be expelled from the academy. This was supposed to be a competition, not an actual fight. If they wanted a real fight, they should have asked for one, and they would have got it. But at this point, Larry simply turned around, looked over at Greknar as she was on the ground still in serious pain, and the rage disappeared, and what replaced it was simple fear. He ran over and began to check her over, and everyone watching couldn't understand why the humans could go from sheer murderous intent to caring so much with such a gentle hand. They would have to ask this question, as this was contention. This was a question that they all began to ask, as most of human history was not something they could find. It was difficult to get a hold of. In fact, seeing humans outside of the academy was almost unheard of. But here he was, taking extra care to lift Greknar up as slowly as possible. As he carried her in his arms, others picked up his gear, and she simply looked up at him and then reached around him and pulled them close. She seemed to be hugging him with almost tears in her eyes, and he simply walked away. A day later, in an attempt to make sure that he didn't get expelled, the Vunshin male, even though still covered in bandages, was walking up to Greknar, keeping his head low, as that was his species' way of trying to say that they were not being a threat at all. He said that he wanted to apologize, but as he got close, he heard someone yell out in a deep voice, "Get away from her, you bitch!" That's when he turned and saw Larry walking up to him again with murderous intent, and simply stand between the Vunshin and Greknar. With that, the Vunshin began to understand. "Oh, she is your mate, then. I understand now. Then I apologize to you as well. I don't know how to do this correctly. Humans do not show us how to apologize for our actions in human ways. This is all I know how." He then lowered his head down, sprayed his arms out to the side, and lowered down to the point where he was almost kissing Larry's feet. With that, he was exposing all the weakest points of his body. "This is how we apologize. I'm sorry." With that, Larry simply looked at him with vitriol still in his eyes and said, "Fine, just stay away from us." "Yes, of course," the Vunshin said as he backed away as quickly but as quietly as he could, again a sign from their species. Larry simply turned over to Greknar to see if she was okay, and she simply looked at him and smiled. Larry smiled back at her and simply put his hand on her cheek, making sure that she had been healing up all right. With her new body, she healed incredibly fast, actually faster than Larry did, which surprised the crap out of him. But he didn't have to worry about that at this point. He simply said, "Hey, we gotta go. Don't forget, Femcast is going into the embassy to get adjusted, and I promised Vince that we'd be there to make sure that, she's calm when she goes in. Did you talk to her about the adjustment she wants to do?" With that, Gregnar simply nodded and kept that smile on her face as they simply walked out. Eventually, they ended up at the embassy, and they saw Vince very concerned. Tashay was next to him trying to console him, and Jenny was there talking all sorts of things to him as well, saying how it's going to be okay, it went fine the first time. They were all a bit concerned, and unfortunately, Femcast had already been taken in. With that, everyone looked over at Greknar, realizing that she was okay, up and walking again, so she was fine. Her and Jenny kind of went up and gave each other a bit of a hug, and then Greknar actually had a separate question. So, with the adjustments, why are your eyes different in the video that I watched? With that, all the humans kind of looked at each other and realized they're in the embassy, so they should be safe. Well, that's something we don't really put out that often, so let me show you. Jenny pulled down her black glasses that she had always been wearing. Though they're not large, as she's not a large person and large glasses wouldn't fit her face, as soon as she uncovered them and opened them up, Greknar's eyes got really big. Looking into Jenny's eyes, she saw that they were not blue or green or even yellow. They were purple. A very light purple on the inside, almost like a star. And on the outside was a deep, deep blue, almost like a navy blue. It was strange to see. Why are your eyes that way? Greknar said, as she actually reached up towards her own eyes, realizing the answer to the question before she even got an answer. It's a side effect of the adjustment. Everybody's eyes come out a bit different. For me, they come out something like this, but what nobody was expecting with your species is that the green, that's not a normal color for yours, is it? Greknar still now had both hands up next to her eyes, realizing that her eyes, though adjusted enough that she would keep her original vision, at least for the most part, when she looked in the mirror, her eyes were an unnatural color. Why, with all the adjustments? It just happens, Larry said. Huh. Makes me wonder, Vince blurted out. Of what? Jenny asked. I just wonder what color eyes my girlfriend's going to come out with.